In April 1930, after a long march to the sea, Mohandas Gandhi walked onto a beach in western India and picked up a handful of salt. It was not dramatic to look at. No crown, no cannon, no secret document, just an old man, a shoreline, and a little white mineral. But under British rule, Indians were forbidden to make or sell their own salt. They had to buy it through a government monopoly with a tax attached. So when Gandhi picked up salt from the shore, he was breaking the law in front of the entire empire. The act was almost comically small, which is exactly why it worked. Because salt is not rare jewelry. It is not a palace luxury. It is ordinary. Everyone needs it, and that made it dangerous. So why did governments keep fighting over something that now sits quietly on a kitchen table? This is the history of salt. Salt is easy to underestimate because modern life has made it boring. It comes in a shaker, in a packet, in a chip bag, and in the alarming part of a nutrition label. But for most of human history, salt was not just flavor. It was one of the ways life stayed organized. Human bodies need sodium and chloride. Animals seek salt. People who sweat, travel, farm, fight, or live far from naturally salty foods have to replace what the body loses, which means salt is not optional in the same way a decorative sauce is optional. It is one of those humble substances that becomes invisible only after civilization gets very good at delivering it. And invisible or not, it has shaped where humans could settle, travel, and survive. You do not build a city far from salt unless you have a very reliable way to bring it in. Before refrigeration, food had a terrible habit of becoming not food. Fish spoiled, meat spoiled, harvests came all at once and then vanished into winter. Salt helped change that. Salting, brining, curing, and pickling let people stretch food across seasons and distance. It did not stop time exactly, but it did make time a little more negotiable. A salted fish could travel farther than a fresh one. A cured meat could wait for an army. A barrel of provisions could survive a voyage. Cheese, butter, and olives owed their range to salt. So did the pickled vegetables that outlasted a siege. A Roman soldier carried salted pork. A Viking longship carried dried cod. A Chinese merchant moved preserved duck inland. Salt did not just save dinner. It changed where people could live, fight, and trade. In a world without a freezer aisle, salt was not a seasoning. It was logistics. And once a substance feeds armies, ships, cities, and winters, it stops being merely domestic. The next problem was geography. Salt does not appear evenly across the world, politely distributed for everyone's convenience. Some places had seacoasts and evaporation pans. Some had springs, some had mines, some had very little. And that difference created roads. In West Africa, salt from the Sahara moved south by caravan into regions where it was scarce and valuable. Camel caravans carried slabs of rock salt across deserts, and in some places salt could be exchanged for gold dust. That sounds like an exaggeration until you remember the costs: distance, danger, bulk, hunger, heat, and the fact that people kept needing more. Salt was abundant at the source and expensive at the destination, which is basically the opening line of half of economic history. In some places, salt itself became money. Ethiopians once traded bars of rock salt as currency. So did people in the Sahara, where a slab of salt could buy a slave. The great salt routes were as famous as the Silk Road, and just as profitable for the people who controlled them. Whoever controlled the mine, the road, the river port, or the market did not merely control a product. They controlled access. The word salary hints at this connection, even if the Roman story is messier than the myth. Salt was so reliable that governments eventually stopped trusting anyone else to control it. Naturally, governments noticed. History contains many kinds of state, but most of them eventually discover the receipt. Salt was tempting because everyone needed it, and because it often moved through visible choke points: mines, pans, depots, roads, warehouses. A ruler did not have to find every kitchen. He only had to find the place salt passed through on the way to the kitchen. China developed long-running systems of salt administration and monopoly. European states built salt taxes into their revenue. Empires watched the white mineral very carefully. The Chinese salt monopoly lasted for more than 2,000 years. It built armies, canals, and entire bureaucracies whose only job was to track a white crystal. At its height, salt provided over half of some Chinese dynasties' revenue. That is not a seasoning. That is a pillars for the state. Even Rome left us a famous temptation. People love to say that salary comes from Roman soldiers being paid in salt. The word connection to salt is real. The neat story is messier. Roman soldiers were not simply lining up for payday with a sack of seasoning. Still, the fact that the myth survives tells you something. Salt feels like it belongs near money, work, roads, and power. In 1648, Moscow erupted over a salt tax. Riots swept the city. The Tsar's salt office burned. People died over the price of preservation. In British India, the salt tax was so punishing that Gandhi's Dandi March was not the first protest, only the most famous. Every empire that tried to own salt learned the same lesson. People notice when you tax their dinner. Salt could even become a social signal. In wealthy households, the salt cellar was not always a humble little object hiding behind the pepper. It could be ornate, expensive, and placed where everyone could see it. The old phrase, above the salt, comes from a world where the salt on the table could help mark status and seating. Sit near the head of the table, near the important people, and you were above the salt. Sit farther down, and the meal quietly explained your place in society. Tiny object, very large ego. In Venice, the Doge gave a golden salt cellar as a state gift. In Japan, salt was thrown to purify a wrestling ring. In Jewish tradition, it sealed a covenant. The mineral was so ordinary that every culture found a way to make it sacred. The trouble with taxing a necessity is that people notice. In France before the Revolution, the gabelle became one of the most hated examples. A salt tax with unequal rates, privileged exemptions, and enough resentment to fill the grievance lists of 1789. High rates and uneven rules encourage smuggling. If the law makes ordinary life too expensive, ordinary life starts looking for a side door. The gabelle did not cause the French Revolution by itself. History is rarely that tidy. But it showed how dangerous a daily necessity can become when the state uses it as a revenue machine. The same pattern appears again and again. Salt is ordinary, so governments tax it. Salt is ordinary, so people hate being controlled through it. That is why Gandhi chose salt. He was not choosing the grandest object in the empire. He was choosing the most understandable one. A poor person needed salt. A rich person needed salt. A worker, a farmer, a child, a cook, a protester, and a policeman all understood it. Gandhi marched about 240 miles from Sabarmati to Dandi, gathering attention village by village. On April 6th, he picked up salt from the shore and turned a tax law into something you could hold in your hand. The response spread. Indians made salt, sold salt, marched on salt works, and filled jails. By the end of the year, tens of thousands had been imprisoned. The empire did not fall that morning on the beach, but a very old fact had become impossible to ignore. When a government controls a necessity, everyday life becomes political. And the protest worked in part because the object was so small. A crown is abstract. A handful of salt is not. You cannot argue with hunger. You cannot debate thirst. And you cannot hide a monopoly on something everybody needs. Salt made the empire's paperwork feel personal, one kitchen at a time. Today, salt is cheap enough to disappear into the background. That is the strange ending. The thing people mined, marched for, smuggled, taxed, displayed, and guarded now waits beside dinner. Salt did not rule the world by itself. It did something quieter. It made food last, roads matter, governments inventive, and ordinary people very aware of who was allowed to touch the basics of life. Modern industry mines it by the ton. Chemical plants turn it into chlorine and caustic soda. Road crews spread it on ice. The salt on your table has probably traveled farther than your last vacation through a supply chain no Roman could have imagined. And yet, the pinch you use tonight does the same work it did for a Viking sailor, a Chinese merchant, or a man on a beach in 1930.